Hello, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. So today is 19th May 2025 and today we have a few very important topics from different newspapers. And all these topics that we are going to discuss are very important for both prelims and mains exams. So the first topic that we are going to discuss is about the government's changed policy stance on the nuclear energy. Now, what is the changed policy stance of the government of India with respect to nuclear energy? So earlier, the nuclear energy generation is completely under the control of the government itself. So government did not allow any private players into the generation of nuclear energy. But now the government has been thinking to give a certain extent the nuclear energy generation to the private sector as well. So the government has been thinking about allowing private operators into the nuclear energy field or nuclear arena. So remember that earlier it was completely under the domination of the public sector alone, but now the government has been thinking to allow private players, private operators into the nuclear energy field. So remember that we have the goal of achieving 100 gigawatt of nuclear energy by 2047. So by 2047, India aimed at generating around 100 gigawatt of energy from the nuclear power plants. Now in this context, it is very important that it should no longer be under the public sector, and there is a need for active engagement from the private sector as well. However, the government aimed at certain policy reforms and changes in the existing legislations to allow private sector to play a very important role in generation of nuclear energy, so that we can achieve this objective of generating 100 gigawatt of nuclear energy by the year 2047. And also remember that as of now we have been producing around 8,000 megawatts of energy from the nuclear power plants, the existing nuclear power plants. So therefore the government aimed at substantially scaling up the production of nuclear energy. So what are the advantages of nuclear energy compared to the other energy resources, particularly the thermal energy or thermal power plants, which uses coal as a raw material? So here coal is a fossil fuel. But in India, around 50 to 55% of electricity is produced from the thermal power plants, which uses coal as a raw material. But coal is a fossil fuel, and when we burn coal, it emits greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and greenhouse gases further cause the global warming. And along with global warming, India may not be able to fulfill its emission targets. India may not be able to achieve its emission targets. So what are the emission targets that India already set in? For example, we wanted to become net zero by 2070. India wanted to become net zero by 2070. So if we continue to depend on the coal for generation of electricity, which emit greenhouse gases, we may not be able to achieve the existing emission targets. So in this context, there is a need to promote the nuclear energy. So here nuclear energy is also considered as a clean fuel, right? So it is also considered as a clean fuel. This is the first advantage. And the second advantage is nuclear fuel has high energy generating potential. So because of these advantages, it is very important that we need to switch, or we need to move away from the fossil fuels such as coal and other fossil fuels. So we need to rapidly depend on the renewable fuels along with the nuclear energy as well. But another thing that we need to talk about here is that when we think about the renewable energy resources, what are the renewable energy resources? The wind energy, solar energy. So mostly with renewable energy resources, the problem of intermittency comes here, right? So the problem of intermittency is the key problem here, right? So there is no reliable generation of electricity from the renewable energy resources, first thing. Second thing is that the technology is in the developmental phase. Technology is in the developmental phase when it comes to the renewable energy, right? So once we have adequate technology, we will be able to produce adequate amount of electricity from the renewable fuels, and it also significantly cut down the cost, and it would make energy more affordable as well as more reliable as well. But it is a long-term process. Since it is a long-term process, we need to depend more on nuclear energy, and that's why we have set this target. But how this target will be achieved? So this target will be achieved not just by the public sector. So if nuclear energy generation continues to be under the public sector, we may not be able to achieve this target. So therefore it is important to encourage private investment as well. We need to encourage private investment in nuclear energy, and the small modular reactors should also be promoted under the private sector. So that's how we will be able to achieve our targets. So as part of this, the government has been planning to allow the private operators into the nuclear energy field. I hope it is very clear for you. Now, as part of this plan, what the government has been doing? So the government has been planning two important legislative amendments. So they will be introduced in the monsoon session of the parliament, right? So the amendments will likely be introduced in the monsoon session of the parliament. There will be two key legislative amendments, and the legislative amendments aimed at opening up atomic energy generation to the private sector and also the foreign players, right? So atomic energy generation will be opened not just to the Indian private players but also the foreign players as well, so that these targets can be achieved. And in fact, this particular move from the government actually follows a significant regulatory clearance that has been recently given by US, right? So US has given a regulatory clearance for some companies, right? So some private companies to invest in India's nuclear energy generation. And in fact, it is expected to unlock the commercial potential of Indo-US Civil Nuclear Agreement, and this agreement is also called as 123 Agreement. 123 Agreement. Both India and US signed the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. So this agreement essentially aimed at India generating electricity through the nuclear power plants. Now, what legislative reforms? So we have discussed that the government has been planning to introduce two key legislative reforms. Two key legislative reforms in the next monsoon session of the parliament. Now, what are those two key amendments that will be introduced by the government, right? So firstly, amendment to the nuclear liability law. Amendment to nuclear liability law. So the problem with the nuclear liability law that has been passed in the year 2010 is that if any private player wanted to invest in nuclear energy generation in India, so in case of any accident, the total liability will be on the private player who invested in the nuclear energy generation. So this comes in the backdrop of several nuclear nuclear reactor accidents that previously took place. For example, Fukushima nuclear reactor accident, Chernobyl nuclear reactor accident. So in this backdrop, the government has came up with a Civil Liability Nuclear Damage Act of 2010, and under this particular act, the private players would have the maximum liability. That means in case of a nuclear accident, these private players have to pay a certain amount of compensation to the people who have been affected by such nuclear accidents or damages. I hope it is clear for you. The Civil Liability Nuclear Damage Act has been passed in the year 2010. But in order to allow the private sector to come and invest in nuclear energy generation in India, we need to amend this draconian act. We need to amend this particular legislation. So the first amendment that the government has been planning to introduce is the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act 2010 amendment. Right? So currently, the Civil Liability Nuclear Damage Act 2010, so it channels the liability for nuclear accidents to the equipment vendors. For example, imagine that there is a nuclear power plant called A, and it has been established in the state of Maharashtra, and this particular nuclear power plant equipment has been supplied by a particular company called JET. So equipment supplier or equipment vendor. Here company Z is equipment vendor. So in case of a nuclear accident that took place in the nuclear power plant A in Maharashtra, then the liability will be faced by the equipment vendor. I hope it is very clear for you that the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damages Act 2000, it channels the liability for nuclear accidents in the existing nuclear power plants to the equipment vendors. So because of this reason, the equipment vendors are not ready to supply important equipment to the nuclear power plants. And because of that reason, we may not be able to generate adequate amount of nuclear energy as well, right? And because of the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damages Act 2010, a lot of companies are fearing to come and invest in nuclear energy generation and even supply equipment to the existing nuclear power plants in India, right? So a major global players such as GE Hitachi, Westinghouse and Framatome, so they are deterred from investing in India because of this particular legislation. Because in case of any accident, the liability will be completely on the suppliers, the equipment vendors or the suppliers, right? So that's why they are deterred to invest in India's nuclear energy, right? So the amendment seeks to make a certain changes. So what changes will likely be introduced under Civil Liability for Nuclear Damages Act 2010? So firstly, there will be a cap on the liability for vendors. So still the liability will be faced by the vendors, but there will be a certain cap or a certain limitation on the liability. Not the complete liability of a nuclear accident, but there will be a certain cap so that the private players would come and invest in India in nuclear energy generation, firstly. Secondly, introduction of a time-bound liability window. So what does this mean, the time-bound liability window? For example, time-bound liability window means that imagine there is again a nuclear power plant called A in the state of Maharashtra, and for this nuclear power plant, a vendor called JED, a private company called JED supplied equipment. Now in this case, the government will mandate that the liability on company JED will be only for 10 years. And after that, the company JED will not be responsible for any accident that took place in the nuclear power plant A, right? So this is what is called as the time bound liability window. I hope it is clear. The third is that the government expected to reassure the foreign investors, right? Because foreign investors are deterred to invest in India because of the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act 2010, because the major liability is on the private companies in case of any accident that took place. So in this context, in order to encourage the private players to come and invest in India in nuclear energy generation, the government has been planning to reassure the foreign investors by mitigating their long-term legal and financial risks. Right? So government wanted to mitigate their long-term legal and financial risks so that it will incentivize the private players to come and invest in India's nuclear energy generation, right? So this is the first amendment that the government planning to brought in. So what is the second amendment that the government will likely bring in? The second amendment will be amendments to the Atomic Energy Act of 1962, right? So understand one thing, that the second amendment to the Atomic Energy Act 1962, so it would again allow the private players and foreign firms, private Indian companies and foreign firms to operate nuclear power plants. So as of now, they cannot operate the nuclear power plant. Under Atomic Energy Act of 1962, only the government companies will operate the nuclear power plants, but private companies are not allowed to operate the nuclear power plants. However, if amendments to the Atomic Energy Act 1962 are made, then the private Indian companies and foreign firms will also allowed to operate the nuclear power plants. So earlier, currently, so it is only reserved for the state-owned entities such as Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited and National Thermal Power Corporation. So only NTPC and Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited are allowed. So only these two public limited companies are allowed to operate the nuclear power plants. Private individuals and foreign firms are not allowed. But Atomic Energy Act 1962, if the government brings amendment, this amendment will allow the private players and also the foreign firms as well. And overall, it will enable the public-private partnership in the nuclear energy generation and encourage the private players to come and invest in nuclear energy generation, and ultimately that will help us achieve the target of generating 100 gigawatt of nuclear energy by the year 2047, and that is what we have been aiming for. Thirdly, this amendment to Atomic Energy Act of 1962, it also opens doors for minority equity participation, right? So it will also enable the minority equity participation by foreign firms in upcoming nuclear projects in India. This is another advantage. And the third advantage is that it will increase competition because of increased participation of the private players, and it will also result in technology infusion because India is a very big market and India's energy demand will likely increase in the coming future, and India as of now significantly and substantially dependent on fossil fuels, and we also have plans to make a transition from the fossil fuels to more sustainable and clean green fuels. And that would attract the private players to come and invest in the nuclear energy arena as well, and that mandates certain amendments. We need to make certain amendments to the existing legislations because existing legislations are so rigid that the private players are not able to come and invest in India's nuclear energy generation, and these are the problems, and these are the two amendments that India would likely bring in the coming monsoon session. So in this context, as we have already discussed in the beginning, that US has cleared the private companies for investing in India. So earlier there were certain restrictions on the US private companies investing in India's nuclear energy generation program. But recently, in March 2025, what happened was a US Department of Energy gave a regulatory clearance to Holtec International. So Holtec International is a private company and that engages with the nuclear energy generation. So therefore, the Department of Atomic Energy gave a regulatory clearance to Holtec International, and this regulatory clearance has allowed the company to transfer small modular reactors. So we'll also understand what are small modular reactors. Before also we have discussed them, the small modular reactors, right? So this regulatory clearance from US would allow this particular company to transfer the small modular reactors technology to its Indian partners. So the Indian partner for Holtec International is Tata Consulting Engineers and Larsen and Toubro, right? So therefore this particular company will transfer the small modular reactor technology to Tata Consulting Engineers and Larsen and Toubro, and this approval under Part 810 of the US Atomic Energy Act, and this was considered as the game changer in India's nuclear energy generation or nuclear energy sector. Now, why it is a game changer? What are the reasons because of which we have been considering this decision of US or regulatory clearance from US is a game changer actually? So this is a game changer because it previously prohibited US firms from engaging in nuclear design and manufacturing work in India, right? So this regulation previously prevented the US firms, the private companies engaging in nuclear design, and they cannot do the manufacturing work in India. So that is the problem. But after regulatory clearance, the private firms can easily do the nuclear design and they can also undertake the manufacturing work in India as well. Secondly, the clearance now enables the co-production and technology transfer, right? So it essentially means that both US companies and Indian companies can engage in co-production and technology transfer as well, and that is what has been happening here, right? Particularly with respect to the small modular reactors. So we'll understand what are the advantages, what are the benefits of these small modular reactors as well. So ultimately, US giving the regulatory clearance to its private firms to transfer the small modular reactor technology to the Indian firms is actually aligning with India's larger goals to localize manufacturing and also reduce the energy import dependency. So here I would like to tell you that India has been importing around 85% of its fossil fuel from other countries. 85% of fossil fuels from other countries. Secondly, India don't have a substantial local manufacturing of the equipment related to the nuclear power plants, and in a way that is also limiting India's capability, India's ability to produce adequate amount of nuclear energy. Remember, as I've already told you, that we have been planning to generate 100 gigawatt of nuclear energy by the year 2047. So 2047 is also the year by which we would like to become a developed country or Vikasit Bharat. And in fact, this actually marks a significant shift in aligning Washington's regulatory stance with New Delhi's strategic and commercial interests. Right? So that's why it is considered as a game changer. Because of all these different reasons, the decision or the regulatory clearance from US is considered as a game changer for India. However, a broader geostrategic, geopolitical interests are also involved in this decision from US. Right? So in fact, the reforms from US side are actually part of the broader trade and investment outreach with the US. Remember that India and US have been planning to sign a free trade agreement, and negotiations have been taking place for a comprehensive India-US trade pact. Because as of now, the tariffs, counter tariffs and reciprocal tariffs, so it is very often in news. So ultimately, we would like to arrive at a comprehensive India-US trade agreement. However, these reforms from US can be seen as a broader trade and investment outreach with the US. Right? So in fact, the inclusion of this nuclear cooperation, it could further enhance the bilateral relationship between India and US. So how it further expands the bilateral relationship? Through number of ways. Firstly, it will expand the clean energy cooperation. So India and US will cooperate in renewable energy front, and they will also cooperate in the nuclear energy generation as well. Secondly, it will further strengthen the strategic trust between US and India as well. So both these countries have the shared interests, common vision, and they are started aligning their interests as well, and this will benefit both the countries in the long term. And similarly, positioning India as a future export hub for the nuclear technology as well. So once we have the technology for manufacturing small modular reactors in India, then India will become an export hub for the nuclear technology, particularly with respect to the small modular reactors. So I hope it is clear for you. Next, what are these small modular reactors? So we'll try to understand about this aspect as well. Now, small modular reactors are smaller than the traditional nuclear reactors. So they are very smaller in size, and modular actually means that they could be pre-assembled in the factories, and then they will be transported to the site for a very quick installation. Right? So they will be pre-installed and they can be transferred to the or transported to the site for a very quick installation, and they can be used as a nuclear fission to produce energy. So they use nuclear fission to produce electricity. As of now, throughout the world, most of the nuclear reactors have been using the nuclear fission to produce energy. Now here, when we discuss about the small modular reactors, so small modular reactors can actually have the capacity of generating around 300 megawatt of electricity, right? Or it is also 1/3 of the total electricity that has been produced by the traditional large scale nuclear reactors, right? So I hope this point is clear for you. Secondly, the small modular reactors can produce a large amount of low carbon electricity. So there are carbon emissions also, but here the advantage is that a less or low carbon emissions, and this will further help India's decarbonization drive as well. So these are the two advantages of the small modular reactors. And within the small modular reactors, so as I have already told you that the small modular reactors can produce around 300 megawatt of electricity through the nuclear fission. However, there are certain micro reactors also. They can produce up to 30 megawatt of electricity. However, the large conventional reactors, they can produce 700 megawatt or more electricity. Right? So this is the difference between the conventional large scale nuclear reactors and small modular reactors. Right? So in fact, in this article from the Hindu, that Finance Minister in her budget speech 2024-25 and 25-26, so she emphasized on contributions from the nuclear power for India to meet the renewable energy targets. Right, so whatever renewable energy targets that we have already put in place, so those renewable energy targets can be met if we are able to generate adequate electricity from the nuclear power plants. Right. So however, the small modular reactors have a huge role to play here. Right. So it is expected that through small modular reactors, we could substantially increase the generation of electricity from the nuclear energy. And in fact, the small modular reactors are designed to be smaller, flexible, and easier to build compared to the traditional nuclear setups. And in fact, each small modular reactor can produce less than around 300 megawatt of power. So this is the advantage of the small modular reactor over the conventional large scale reactors. So I hope you have understood that ultimately the government has been planning to allow the private players in generating the nuclear energy, because we have certain goals and objectives, and we would also like to increase our clean energy generation capacity as well. So next important topic. Recently what happened was that ISRO's 101st mission failed, right? So we'll understand the reasons for the failure of this mission. So we will also understand the polar satellite launch vehicle and the geosynchronous satellite launch vehicle and the differences, right? So the 101st launch of ISRO is through a launch vehicle called PSLV C61, and this has been carrying the Earth observation satellite 09, right? So PSLV C61 has been carrying the Earth observation satellite 09, and this 101st mission of ISRO has been failed. So we'll understand the reasons for that. Okay, so it has failed in the mid-flight due to a reason called chamber pressure drop, right? So within the chambers of this PSLV, so there is a substantial decline in the pressure, and particularly this took place in the third stage, right? So in the third stage, due to chamber pressure drop, the 101st launch of PSLV C61 has been failed. So this mission aimed to place the Earth observation satellite 09 in the sun synchronous polar orbit, right? So it aimed to put the Earth observation satellite in the sun synchronous polar orbit, but in its third stage it has been failed. Now what are the key reasons for the failure of the PSLV C61? Now in fact, so it has performed well in the first two stages, right? So it has multiple stages. In its first two stages, its performance was completely normal, right? So in fact its launch was also normal, and we can also say that its launch was also successful. And in fact, so in PSLV there are 4 stages. In PSLV there are 4 stages, so you have to remember this. And first 2 stages are successful, but in the third stage what happened was there is a substantial decline in the chamber pressure. In the third stage, a decline in the chamber pressure. So because of the decline of chamber pressure in PSLV C61, this ultimately resulted in the failure of the mission. And in fact, so as I have already told you that the issue has been in the third stage. So during the third stage there is a substantial decline in the chamber pressure, and that substantial decline in the chamber pressure of solid rocket motor, it has been observed, and that ultimately resulted in the failure of the mission. And in fact, the fall in the pressure has compromised the thrust generation, because if it is escaping, so if the rocket has been escaping the gravitation of the earth, right, so the gravity of the earth, then it must require the adequate amount of thrust. But here the declining chamber pressure has compromised the thrust generation of the PSLV C61 in the third stage. And in fact, the thrust is very, very important to propel the vehicle further into the intended sun synchronous polar orbit. So since there is a drop in the chamber pressure and it was not able to get adequate thrust, and that ultimately resulted in the failure of the mission. And due to this anomaly, Earth observation satellite EOS 09, so it could not be placed in its intended orbit because of this failure. Now when we talk about the Earth observation satellite 09 mission, now what are the benefits that we get if it is successful? right? So the Earth Observation Satellite 09 is also similar to Earth Observation Satellite 04. And in fact, the Earth Observation Satellite 09 is intended to provide a frequent imaging for the operational applications such as agriculture, forestry, soil moisture, disaster management, and flood monitoring. So these are the potential benefits or advantages of the Earth Observation Satellite 09 if it is successfully launched into the sun synchronous orbit. However, the Earth Observation Satellite 09 is also equipped with the synthetic aperture radar called SAR. Right, so it is also equipped with synthetic aperture radar, and this synthetic aperture radar is capable of capturing the high resolution images regardless of weather or the light conditions. And in fact, the intended orbit is the sun synchronous polar orbit, and this sun synchronous polar orbit is crucial for consistent lighting conditions in the Earth observations, because this is an Earth observation satellite, and such an Earth observation satellite should be placed under the sun synchronous polar orbit for consistent lighting conditions in Earth observation. And in fact, the PSLV C61 is ISRO's 101st launch, and thereby it has been reinforcing the importance and frequency of PSLV in India's space program. So remember that PSLV is called as the workhorse of ISRO, because of its successful missions. So a failure of PSLV launch vehicle is very rare, right? So failure of any of the launches using PSLV is very rare, and because of that reason it is called as the workhorse of the ISRO. But the failure of PSLV C61 has to be looked into. A deeper analysis has to be required, so that any such future anomalies or future missions will not be failed. Right, so here the difference between the polar satellite launch vehicle and geosynchronous satellite launch vehicle. Now here, if we talk about the polar satellite launch vehicle, now it is considered as the workhorse of the ISRO, as I have already mentioned to you, right? So this is called as the workhorse of ISRO, and in fact this is the third generation, and it is a four-staged launch vehicle. Within the four-staged launch vehicle, the first stage and the third stage are equipped with the solid fuel, right? So they are equipped with the solid fuel, and second stage and fourth stage are equipped with liquid fuel. So you have to remember this. So it is a four-staged vehicle. It is third generation vehicle firstly. So apart from third generation vehicle, it is a four-staged vehicle. First and third stage are equipped with the solid fuel. Second and fourth stage are equipped with the liquid fuel. Now, what is the capacity of the polar satellite launch vehicle? So it actually delivers the Earth observation satellite, the Earth observation satellite 09. It is also an Earth observation satellite. And in fact, PSLV is used to launch satellites with a lower mass of around 1400 kilograms. So there are four variants of PSLV: PSLV CA, PSLV QL, PSLV DL, and PSLV XL. So these are the four variants of the PSLV, right? So it actually launches the satellites into the low inclination low Earth orbit, sub geotransfer orbit, and the geotransfer orbit. So important launches using the polar satellite launch vehicle, including the first successful launch took place in October 1994, Chandrayaan-1 in the year 2008, and Mars Orbiter spacecraft in the year 2013. So when we talk about the geosynchronous satellite launch vehicle, GSLV, so GSLV is a fourth stage, or it is a fourth generation launch vehicle. So PSLV is a third generation and GSLV is the fourth generation launch vehicle. However, in PSLV there are 4 stages, but in GSLV there are only 3 stages, right? So you have to remember this. In GSLV there are only 2 stages, and in fact, so it is much more powerful rocket than the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle. And in fact, the GSLV also carries satellites deeper into the space as well. And in fact, the GSLV also uses the indigenous cryogenic upper stage. So cryogenic upper stage is a very important for enhancing the efficiency of the launch vehicles. So when we talk about the capacity of the GSLV, what is the capacity of GSLV? So it is used to launch the communication satellites, and it carries the heavier satellites around 2200 kgs to geotransfer orbit, and it carries around 10,000 kg satellites into the low Earth orbit. So therefore it has a much more higher capacity than the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle. And in fact, the launches it actually launches satellites into geosynchronous transfer orbit around 36,000 kilometers of altitude. So important launches using GSLV including Chandrayaan 2 and upcoming Gaganyaan missions. So I hope it is very clear for you. So the next important topic is an article on caste census that has been given in the Hindu newspaper, and this is important for your general studies paper 2 and general studies paper 1 as well. The context is that we already knew that the government has decided to conduct a comprehensive caste census, but here it is being said that caste census will not have a huge impact on the social justice policies that the government would undertake. Right? So in fact, the government of India has proposed a caste census. So that is a caste enumeration in the upcoming decennial census. In India, we knew that census are conducted once in a 10 years. And this year it is decided that as part of the census data collection, so we will also collect the caste census as well. So this is the 16th census that we have been conducting, and along with the census we will also have the caste census as well, and ultimately it has reignited the debate over the efficacy of conducting the caste census. Now, what is the intent that the government has when it has been decided to conduct the caste census, and what is the utility of conducting a caste based census and the data that has been generated through the caste census, and ultimately how it is going to impact the policy making for social justice and the welfare distribution, right? So this is how the caste census would have ignited the debate. The caste census has actually ignited the debate. Now, what is a caste census? Firstly, we'll try to understand this. What exactly is a caste census? So caste census means collection of data on caste identity of various individuals, and this has been part of a population enumeration, right? For example, when we are conducting census, as part of the census we will also conduct the census, we'll also collect the data on different castes. For example, there are different caste groups within OBCs, within SCs, STs, and even general category also, right? So as part of the population census, we'll also collect the caste data. So that is the caste census in a very simple manner. And last comprehensive caste census data was collected in the year 1931, and after independence, a scheduled caste and scheduled tribes recorded in the census. However, in 2011 also the Union government conducted socio-economic caste census, right? But it was not officially released due to certain inconsistencies which are existing, right? So this is the caste census. Now, what is the role of caste census and what are the merits of caste census? We'll try to understand this aspect as well. So caste census can be used for the data driven or evidence based policy making, right? So that's why you can say that caste census could be an empirical basis for the policy making, because the caste census can actually offer a huge amount of data on different caste groups and their socio-economic progress or the backwardness. So ultimately, the caste data, if we have, that will help us in making targeted policies for affirmative action and also legitimizing the welfare programs in the courts. For example, the 103rd constitutional amendment has provided 10% of the reservation for the economically weaker sections. And if we have conducted the caste census, we would be able to know about the people who are the most backward groups. We have adequate data about the socio-economic backwardness and progress of different caste groups. So with that particular data, we can actually justify the welfare programs which are targeting those backward classes in the courts. So this is the first advantage of conducting the caste census. The second advantage is that within the OBCs there are number of caste groups who forms part of the OBCs. So Mandal Commission has recommended that 27% of the reservation should be given to the OBCs in education and the public employment. So therefore, OBC consisting of multiple caste groups, a Justice Rohini Commission has been appointed. And this commission was tasked with the subcategorization of OBCs. So this essentially means that within the OBCs, the Rohini Commission will subcategorize different castes based on their backwardness. So therefore, most backward groups within the OBCs will get the most benefits of the 27% of the reservation. So when we conduct a census, a caste census, we get to know that who are the most backward classes, who are the progressive castes within the OBCs, and subcategorization will also be possible, and targeted affirmative action and welfare programs which target the backward classes is also possibility, right? So we'll also understand the intra-group disparities with the caste census if we conduct the caste census regularly. And similarly, the caste census is considered as an institutionalizing enumeration exercise, right? Because India is known as a country with a huge diversity, right? So therefore, a regular caste enumeration or conducting caste census will ensure regular monitoring of the marginalized communities and their progress as well. However, it is having certain limitations. What are the limitations that the caste census would likely have? So when we talk about the limitations, so we could actually say that the caste census can be used for politicizing the caste, right? Because the elevating census data as a central or even sole basis for social justice policy making, it misconstrues the census factual role. And secondly, it would also result in overburdening of the existing census machinery if we have been tasking them to conduct the caste census as well along with the population census as well. And in fact, so in case of any political reform from the government, so that would politicize its neutral mandate, risking the institutional integrity as well. And in fact, the historical precedent of policy without data, for example, if you talk about the reservations that the government has provided, the affirmative action, the welfare programs that the government has provided previously, so those welfare programs are already provided without having adequate data about the caste and their relative backwardness. In fact, Mandal Commission has recommended 27% of reservation for the backward classes, and EWS have got 10% of the reservation. So all these reforms were executed without conducting exhaustive caste-based data sets, and it was driven more by a political resolve. And you can also see there are certain arguments against the caste census. For example, the risk of deepening caste identities and divisions, administrative challenges, and the risk of inaccurate data, a possible misuse of the electoral gains, and may contradict the goal of a casteless society. that has been envisioned. So remember that if we have the data about the caste, so there is a policy of appeasement from the government side also, and in fact a more number of seats would also be given to the caste which are considered as most dominant, so that they will have a fair chances of getting elected in the elections, right? So existing data on different caste groups and the political inaction from the government side as well, because it's not that only caste census will provide us all necessary, all relevant data about different caste groups, but we already have a lot of data about different caste groups, because we have already conducted the socio-economic caste census, and National Crime Records Bureau regularly conducts surveys about the crime rate in India in different states, and National Family Health Survey also conduct a huge amount of data. So it is not like we don't have the data. These institutions are already collecting a huge amount of data, and Bihar has already conducted a caste survey successfully, right? So therefore a caste linked inequalities, right? So already a document the caste linked inequalities and the crime rates as well. And similarly, there is an underrepresentation in certain key sectors, whether it is a judiciary, politics, economics, and in different fields there is an underrepresentation of SCs, STs, OBCs and women, right? So there is an evidence about the underrepresentation from these marginalized and vulnerable sections in the private corporate sectors, and even for that matter judiciary also, their representation is very less, and even elite educational institutions also, their representation is very less. So despite having evidence, the government did nothing to increase their representation. So think about the judiciary. In judiciary also, representation of women and representation of judges from the lower caste is also very less. And in fact there is also lack of political will. So if there is a political will, even if we are conducting the caste census, there will be a targeted welfare programs directed towards the least marginalized and most vulnerable sections of the society. And there is also existing a huge policy vacuum, because there is no central policy reform that has followed the existing caste data, and social justice is stalled by the absence of political will but not information scarcity, because we already have a lot of information, but here the problem is that the social justice is actually stalled by lack of the political will rather than lack of information, because we already have the information. So what are the arguments in favor of conducting the caste census? So it would result in the data driven policy, and it would even result in equitable distribution of the reservation benefits that are given to the different sections of the society. For example, 27% reservation has been given to the other backward classes, 15% reservation has been given to the SCs, and around 7.5% reservation has been given to the scheduled tribes, and 10% reservation has been given for the economically weaker sections. And the caste census will also help us identify the socio-economic conditions of different caste groups, and it also supports the evidence-based revision of the OBC list regularly. So that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. And if you like our lecture, please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.